top underrated and top overrated quarterbacks. Nick, I'm going to start with you. Your most underrated fantasy quarterbacks heading into the season.
Yeah, I got 3 here that I want to discuss real quickly, guys. And they all tend to go in this, pick 100 to pick 130, even maybe a little bit later in some formats range. And we start with Dak Prescott, guys, who, of course, was injured last season. And, we had the Cooper Rush experience. And you kind of forget just how effective this Cowboys offense can be when Dak is engaged and fully healthy. It's the guy who was second in MVP voting 2 seasons ago. He's a top 5 fantasy quarterback. He was number 2 in the NFL. In yardage. He was right up there in terms of total touchdown passes. I think the addition of George Pickens, in theory, really adds a nice secondary weapon to this Cowboys offense, something they really haven't had since, CeeDee Lamb's first and second year when Amari Cooper was still there. So I think there's a lot to like about this passing game in Dallas. Obviously, it's a team that doesn't have a whole lot at the running back position. The offensive line is not what it used to be. So I think they are going to have to throw the ball with high volume. Dak Prescott is somebody who continues to go higher and higher. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up, settling closer to that QB8, QB9 range. Right now, he's closer to QB12, QB13. So if you're doing an early draft and you want to wait on quarterback, you're not jumping in on that early tier, he's somebody I'm happy to grab. We talked a little bit about Justin Fields yesterday, and there is a clear disconnect here between Justin Fields, the real life player, and Justin Fields, the fantasy player. Again, like we said yesterday, started those first 6 games for Pittsburgh last year. It's not like he was lighting the world on fire. He was still the 6th ranked fantasy quarterback in that span. He's got job security for the New York Jets. He's got his number 1 receiver now with a new contract in Garrett Wilson. As long as Justin Fields could just hang on to that job, I think he has a really, really good chance to be a top 10 QB this season. He's not being drafted as such right now. And then the last guy that I'll mention, CJ Stroud. Now, I was off CJ Stroud last season when he was going as the QB5, even QB4 in some leagues, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous for a guy who doesn't give you any rushing production. Obviously, if you took him in that range, it was a complete disaster. The Texans offense essentially collapsed and they had to win games on the defensive end. I think we may have now swung back too far the other way, though, guys. He's the QB17 at the NFFC, which hosts a lot of high stakes contests. You got a lot of serious players drafting right now. I think we've gone too far. I think this Texans team should be able to bounce back offensively. Nico Collins is now one of the 5 or 6 best receivers in the NFL. They drafted two receivers to help fill the void left by Stephon Diggs. They won't have Tank Dell for most, if not all of the season, but you also bring in Christian Kirk, who's just rock solid as long as he's healthy. So I'm not saying CJ Stroud, it belongs in that QB6, QB7 discussion, but again, if I'm waiting on quarterback, if I'm looking to add a second quarterback with my last pick in a draft, I am more than happy to click on CJ Stroud.
I'm going to point towards Jordan Love. I think he's a classic last year's bum. We talk about this in baseball a lot and in football. A player that has established a certain level of performance a previous year, didn't reach it last year, though. Remember, though, Jordan Love missed about 2.5 games, left week 18 early, had that elbow that impacted his playoff performance, had the groin injury on that terrible playing surface in Brazil in week 1, missed a couple of games after that and was limited after that. The Packers had tragic wide receiver play last year. They invested in the wide receiver position this year in the draft. First rounder with Matthew Golden, third rounder with Savion Williams. He's going as QB19 in the NFFC. I love taking him at that price. Love getting him there. If I'm going to wait on quarterbacks, I'm going to get 2 of them. Jordan Love happens to be one I'd happily go after.
Nick, okay, overrated time. Your overrated fantasy quarterbacks as we head into draft season.
All right, so I'm going to start with Patrick Mahomes, guys. And look, I think there is a better chance this year than at any point over the last couple of years that we see Patrick Mahomes return to form. But am I willing to invest in him in the 5th round of a fantasy draft? To me, again, there's a good chance that he can get back to the guy that he was, but it's not a great chance. It's not a lock, right? And we're talking about a guy that needs to add about 7 or 8 fantasy points per game compared to where he's been these last couple of years to get back into that elite territory. That's a lot to ask. And I do think if you assume Rashee Rice is healthy this season, that does really change things for the Chiefs offense, but you still have questions about this offensive line. They've just kind of rotated in different tackles. They're switching guys all over the field. They haven't really found anything that works. So it's not enough of a sure thing to me to pop him in round 5 when you can get, in my opinion, some comparable production from other quarterbacks, 20, 30, even 40 picks later in a draft. So he's number 1. And then a couple of guys who go around that pick 90 to 100 range, Caleb Williams and Kyler Murray. And look, with Caleb Williams, there's a lot of projecting involved. There's a lot of optimism with Ben Johnson now at the helm of the Chicago Bears team. But I think there were a lot of concerns for Caleb Williams as a rookie. And I could see the upside, but to me, with both him and Kyler Murray, there are too many other dependable options, guys with comparable ceilings, if not higher ceilings, who go in that same range or slightly after. I would rather take Jared Goff. I would certainly rather take Dak Prescott. I think Brock Purdy is really appealing this season. You could get Justin Fields a couple rounds after Caleb Williams. So I don't necessarily have a problem with either of these quarterbacks. If I'm, taking two quarterbacks later in a draft and you're kind of going with the matchup, whoever has the better defensive matchup on a week-to-week basis. But I don't want to go into next season with Caleb Williams as my QB1. And I would say the same thing about Kyler Murray. We're going on like year 4 now of, all right, maybe this will be the year. Arizona didn't really change anything with this offense. They loaded up on defense this offseason, but I don't see the case for Kyler Murray taking a huge step forward.
It's not going to be a popular take here, but I'm going to say Bo Nix. Getting drafted as the QB 7 or 8, depending where you're looking at, sometimes even as early as 6 over Mahomes and Baker. The rushing numbers were overall pretty impressive, but the second half, they dwindled a little bit more. The last rushing TD was in week 8. If he's not getting those rushing TDs, if he's not getting those rushing yards, what are we getting here? 3,775 passing yards last year, and he stayed fully healthy the whole season. Does he get to 4,000 plus yards this year? Is Evan Ingram going to move that needle enough for him to be more of a guy that fills it up even more? Does Marvin Mims take the next step? I'm not convinced that that's going to be the case. I think they invested in their running game. They invested in their defense. This is going to be a team that's going to want to run the ball a ton. The schedule is going to pick up considerably for the Denver Broncos. Last year, Nix's big run was against Atlanta, Vegas, Cleveland, Indy. Remember that Indy game? He only threw for 130 yards, but he had the 3 touchdowns. Weird game. Jonathan Taylor dropping the fumble. They should have lost that game, not made the playoffs. Chargers, Cincy, KC's subs. Remember, week 18, they played against like the 3rd string, and he threw for 4 touchdowns. Does his O-line remain as healthy and as effective as last year? I'm just not going to pay that price for him. I think this has got some second-year backslide possibilities here.